Too many leaders forget to make future-focused decisions for their organization's long game because they couldn't anticipate how much of an impact they were going to be making in their absence in compared to their presence. That's why this 3-part training series is dedicated to your leadership journey. And in part 3, we're going to be talking about decision making at the pioneering leadership phase. Things like, how do you actually pioneer your organizational culture? How would you anticipate change more naturally and rhythmically? And then what it looks like to make deep investments in future leaders. Now, it goes without saying, but there are literally pioneering leaders in every field of life and work. And what's so cool is how many of these pioneering leaders are actually founders. They started a company, they started a community, they started a network, they started a movement. And I think it's a great case for those of us who, are growing in pioneering leadership, and it shows that self-starters actually become those who start these amazing organizations and movements. So never underestimate the power of your self-leadership and how that can get into the culture at large where you lead. But we're going to talk about how difficult it is not to start a movement, but to sustain it. The reality is it's difficult enough to pioneer something new. It's even harder to future-proof something that has picked up momentum over a few years. After a decade or more, whatever you start is either going to drift into being institutionalized or being mobilized for the next phase. And that's why it's so important for pioneering leaders to stay future focused on future generations. See, a lot of people don't realize this, but organizations can actually become indecisive just like individual people do. And when you're first starting out, you're just trying to figure yourself out. But over time, the organization takes on a mind of its own through the different teams and layers and systems and norms that have been developed over time. So what can happen is, without knowing it, if pioneering leaders or specifically founders are not staying future focused, they're going to find themselves in a very unintentional and traumatic situation, which is they're going to be stuck at a fork in the road. Either their memory is going to end up being hijacked by some unthinkable interpretation of all of their influence, or all of their work is just going to get reduced down to a few cliches, maybe a few museum tours of how things were in the good old days. And we don't want that for you. So what's the culprit behind this? It's basically, being asleep at the wheel, not paying attention to where the organization is going. We can get so focused on just having motion, just getting it going, but we're not really thinking about direction along the way. And that's why, unfortunately, executive decision fatigue keeps many influential leaders from pioneering their organizational cultures to be more resilient and more relational in a way to serve future generations. Maybe you're like, Peter, that doesn't bother me that much. I'm really just trying to start something to, sell it and then move on. But regardless, when you and I get too cluttered in the day job, we cannot imagine the bigger impact we're making through our absence compared to our presence. And when executives can't let go of their business, they render the business of whatever they're doing ineffective, and they will basically make it more unprepared to find its way forward without you. So really ask yourself this question: are you committed to serve your organization, your mission, in your absence as much as in your presence? Now, I get it. Whenever we start talking about this and we hear this, we naturally, unanimously dart to our minds this idea of dying, right? Oh, you're talking about dying. But that's not the only example of influencing your generation through your absence. The reality is that as the team grows, your brand is going to end up being in far more places than you. And that's going to require you to think differently about how you're showing up for everyone. And so, yeah, you can make videos, you can make books, you can kind of spread yourself out through different media outlets, but the organizational culture is what needs the attention. It's not about the whole organization paying attention to one leader. It's about the leader paying attention to the whole organization. And that requires us to be future focused. So this is something I emphasize and insist in my executive coaching. I really want you to practice getting away so that way the team can get ahead. And I see it as a win-win. The leaders need that distance so they can have clarity for, decades in advance. And the team needs space to really make sure that they are personalizing the responsibilities that are happening in the day-to-day operations. So it's a great kind of win-win scenario to make sure that we're both sides of this equation are focusing on what we need to do. And I get that phrase, the leader gets away so the team gets ahead, that applies differently depending on the phase of your leadership journey you're in. So bottom line, don't stall out the daily decisions, but make sure you're practicing future focus. And along with that is going to come the future work that ensures everything you're doing right now has a hopeful future. So believe it or not, your future team is going to need you more than the present team right now. You might say, my team is always, needing me to help them out, put out fires to keep things on track, but you have no idea how much more your future team is going to need that original spark from the founder, from the foundational dynamics that got all this going. And so you want to be diligent to be serving the future team as well as the present team. Now, egocentric cultures are just a different topic altogether. But what I'm talking about are directional leaders who are committed to prepare their people 10 out of 10 times. And they're going to show up to prepare the organizational culture to change with a reliable compass in hand. So pause and think about what I'm just saying right now. A directional leader cares about guiding the organization as a team on a journey, and they're going to give them a reliable compass, but they're not assuming that everything's going to stay the same way. They equip them with that reliable compass because they know the organization is going to have to respond to the landscape. The organization is going to have to navigate and create the next phase. And they're going to have a pioneering mindset, a pioneering approach, not just a followership approach that they just do what they're told. And that can be difficult for executive leaders because we're just looking for a little bit of peace and quiet. And when things are in order, then, it's a little bit easier to manage. But it's important that the executive leaders are making investments in thinking, how are we going to be changing? And how are we changing proactively? And so there's actually a big misunderstanding here in the leadership conversation. Many leaders create an organizational culture that cannot change as though it's never supposed to. It assumes that they've got everything figured out and that change, couldn't possibly be a life-giving experience. A humble leader, whether that's a church planter or a serial entrepreneur or a CEO who's faithfully driving the organization towards its mission day after day, that kind of leader knows the organization is going to need more than them to succeed in the future. And so they need to be prepared to remain true to the foundational dynamics that the founder put in the culture. So let me say that one more time. The founder needs to focus on the foundation, because the foundation is what's going to keep the organization strong for the future. And if we ever lose sight of that in the organizational culture, what were the foundational dynamics that got this thing to where it is, then we won't have the ingredients to innovate or to integrate with the next phase. That's why successful leadership teams anticipate change as a regular part of the job. Let me say it again. That's why successful leadership teams actually anticipate change as a regular part of the job. Anticipating change is not a fireside chat in the emergency mode. Anticipating change should just be a natural part of the executive leadership conversations you have. Please don't wait for death to think deeply about the long-term direction of your organization, and don't wait for death to be proactively changing. Instead, make it a normal part of life, a natural part of work, because we want this thing to be more future focused. And in order to do that, we're willing to both dream and fortify in the name of a hopeful future. So just to kind of summarize before we blast off again, executive decision fatigue comes in many forms, as we've looked at in this training series. But one of the biggest side effects is the impact that it will have on your organization's future. So you can't make light of this. You have to see it for what it is. And anything, whether it's executive decision fatigue or something else that keeps you from being future focused, needs to get brought up and dealt with swiftly, so that way you can serve those people that are on that journey with you. All right, before we go further, let me quickly say thank you for preparing yourself for a long, strong leadership journey. I have a lot of free coaching content just like this. If you'll subscribe to this podcast, prepare to go there, you'll have access to hundreds of hours of coaching content, both in the past and a lot more trainings and great stuff coming in the future. And also, I want you to find my email trail. If you sign up for my email trail, you'll get personalized Pioneer coaching there as well. Okay, let's finish with the paradox of pioneering leadership. I call it future work. What a oxymoron, right? Future work. What is that? Future, I get. I'm excited about the future. Sometimes I'm intimidated about the future, but the future is out there, out of reach, something I really don't know what to do with. Work is something I understand. Work is something I do all the time. Work is something I want to get better at every single day. But when you put these two together, it's very difficult to conceive what the future of your work is going to look like, let alone how to work on your future in a really proactive and meaningful way. And so it's hard. And a lot of pioneering leaders drift back to what is easy or what is understandable instead of stretching themselves further out into more meaningful future work. So the metaphor I love to use here is a pilot in an airplane. The pilot has to anticipate the runway is going to end at some point in order to accelerate the airplane full throttle. And that's the mindset that pioneering leaders need to have. They need to anticipate the future in order to accelerate the work to show up ready for it. And obviously, there's opportunities that we need to go full throttle towards, but there's also challenges, real serious challenges that we need to be preparing for. And that's why leadership preparedness matters. Leadership preparedness is not just us getting prepared to lead, but it's also us preparing leaders to lead in the future. And if you're not having that as a front burner conversation, then you might not be anticipating and definitely not accelerating this conversation the way it deserves. So how do we invest deeply in the future of what we do? And I insist that we need to be preparing leaders to pioneer the organization. Not just we have leaders to do the operations, not just we have people who will do what they're told, not just we have people that we trust to keep things on track, but we're actually investing deeply in a culture of leadership that we trust to pioneer. So that way, when things shift, they will not be shaken. When things, require us to stay agile and not think fragile, we're going to be willing to let those people lead on our behalf, let those people lead on behalf of the organization, because they have the DNA of the organization. They have the pioneering approach that got it to where it is. And that's why foundation matters, because the foundation is ultimately going to be strengthening the future. So, are you intentionally investing in the kind of leadership culture that you would trust to pioneer and maybe even reimagine what the organization is about in a way that doesn't cheat it, that doesn't hijack it, that doesn't take it away from its original reality or its core purpose, but it really is true to the story. And man, there's a lot that could be said about that, but I want you to really ponder it. I want you to be honest about how you're making deep investments in future leaders. All right, in review, decision fatigue just hits harder at the executive level. And it makes sense, right? You may be navigating personal crossroads yourself, on top of the fact that now you're facilitating internal disagreements with your team, maybe even leaders on your team. And then you've got to now consider strategic, deep investments that are supposedly going to be more future focused in nature. I mean, it's too much, right, for any one person. And that's why the antidote to executive decision fatigue is knowing how to stay focused with a hopeful future in mind. And what's going to happen is when you're future focused, or when you're focused on a hopeful future, day in and day out, top to bottom, two things are going to happen. You're going to keep showing up, and you're going to be more willing to share the load. So executive decision fatigue, you need to hear this. You need to keep showing up, but you also need to share the load. And you do that with other people that you're making deep strategic investments into for the future. You're investing in people that are competent and trustworthy. And when you are willing to share the load with them, then you're able to be more future focused, which will take off those side effects of executive decision fatigue. All right, that's it for now. Stay encouraged, stay engaged, and remember, you're going places, so prepare to go there.